Thank you, Eva. And my thanks as well to my colleague, Lance Straight, who introduced me to this event and very kindly offered me a stand for me to pitch me research. I'm an interloper. This is, I don't work in general semantics. This paper is, not kind of attaching to that, but hopefully I can make some connections. I've forgotten my password. Here we go. That's always a good start. And if I do this, then hopefully, there we are. Great, excellent. Okay. Okay, we'll work with that. Okay, so during his 2020 campaign to become the Democrat Party's presidential candidate, Pete Buttigieg was routinely lambasted by queer activists and queer commentators for embodying the politics of homonormativity and, to a lesser extent, homonationalism. Now, it was rare that such commentaries openly criticized Buttigieg for being married, but his marital status was almost always mentioned in those kinds of discussions. So, for instance, in a New Yorker article that outlined the queer critique of Buttigieg, Martha Gessen suggested that Buttigieg personified a specific politics of assimilation. And she said, its message to straight people is, we are just like you, and we all want, and all we want is the right to have what you have: marriage, children, house with a white picket fence, the right to serve in the military. Now, she didn't use the term homonormativity directly, but Gessen was clearly drawing upon Lisa Duggan's original definition of this term, which is a politics that does not contest dominant heteronormative assumptions and institutions, but upholds and sustains them while promising the possibility of a demobilized gay constituency and a privatized, depoliticized culture anchored in domesticity and consumption. Gessen also cited an essay by Greta LaFleur, published in the Los Angeles Review of Books, in which the Yale professor deconstructed this Time magazine photo of Buttigieg and his wife Chastin, suggesting that the image symbolized a heterosexuality without women. Now, it's of course unsurprising that marriage is routinely mentioned in critiques of what Duggan terms the new homonormativity. When she first coined the term back in 2002, Duggan identified the right to marry as a key interest for those who were invested in a politics of kind of neoliberal assimilation. And the fight for same-sex marriage legislation was a prime issue for many of those figures and organizations that she cites in her definition of this term. I won't rehearse an argument that is perhaps familiar to some of you. Suffice to say that the battle for same-sex marriage has been critiqued for the following reasons: for misspending precious political and economic capital on an issue that is perhaps less important than, say, securing healthcare that focuses on LGBTQ lives, or indeed on LGBTQ focused education, or supporting the most marginalized members of that community. It's also been criticized for, primarily benefiting middle and upper middle class white folk. It's been criticized for reaffirming the privileged status of marriage in society, often at the cost of other forms of relationships and queer kinship. And finally, it's been critiqued for framing marriage as some kind of endpoint, a happy ever after for gay civil rights. Now, to be clear, all of these criticisms, I think, at some level are valid, and I'm not disputing that queer critique of marriage. The decision to fight for the right to marry, as well as access to the military and to serve in the military openly, by prioritizing those other issues, were deprioritized. And the financial benefits of marriage mean that it remains far more popular among demographics that have wealth that they want to shelter from the IRS. I say all of this and I should also come out as married. I say all of this because when I call for a more nuanced, more complex, more sensitized approach to same-sex marriage, it's clear that I'm neither unaware nor I'm dismissive of the very important queer critique of marriage. I think that critique matters. But at the same time, now that we have marriage, I think it's beholden on us to look at what that actually means for those who've chosen to enter same-sex unions. And I think this is especially important for that critique of marriage, not least because proponents and queer critics of same-sex marriage have both framed marriage as a domestication of sexuality, a privatizing of queerness. But here's the thing, in many ways, marriage is actually a very public affair. It was something that I myself kind of perhaps wasn't aware of until I entered it, just how public marriage is. And that brings me to the topic of my paper today. So marriage may be between two people, but it's also a public act. And this act, this quite performative act, extends out beyond the marriage day, the wedding day itself, and is something that's enacted on an almost daily basis and in front of myriad witnesses. This performance is primarily through language, sometimes just a single word. And the role of language in same-sex marriage is what I want to focus on today. So for the past few years, I've been engaged in a project focused on interrogating homonormativity. And that project was published as a book. Oh, I put the book up there. What a surprise. In which I explore homonormativity across a series of case studies. And indeed, one of those case studies involved interviewing around 40 men who have entered into same-sex marriages to develop a critical understanding of how gay and bisexual men do marriage. And these interviews explored the motivations for getting married, the ways in which that union was celebrated, and the experiences of married life as married men. And it's that latter element, the experience of married life, that I want to talk about today. And in particular, I want to see the ways in which marriage has made my participants feel more seen, more queerly visible in their day-to-day lives. So, dropping the H-bomb. Dropping the H-bomb was how one of my interviewees framed his use of the word husband in everyday life. Rick and I had been discussing how he and his partner referred to each other, and he talked continuously as he reflected on the terminology he used to refer to his significant other. He said, I don't know what it is, but husband is such a new word for me. I've not had a husband for a very long time, but I've had a partner for a very long time. Rick and his husband, Trevor, had been together for 17 years, but married for less than one when I interviewed them. The term husband was something that they were still growing accustomed to using. And I asked Rick to reflect on his use of this new term in daily life and in public contexts. And he said, I can think of times on the phone and mentioning my partner. I think it depends on who you're talking to, and sometimes it's just easier to say partner than husband. But I'm quite happy to say husband. I don't hesitate. Well, actually, maybe I do. Rick's response illustrates the negotiation work that many of my interviewees found themselves engaging in following their marriage. The decision over when and where and how to use the term husband was not something that they'd anticipated prior to getting married. And many of them were eager to talk about their thoughts on, negotiations with, and experiences of dropping the H-bomb. Indeed, that weaponized terminology, H-bomb, that Rick used in his interview, identifies one of the most prominent themes to have emerged from these discussions, that of disruption, that of some kind of power, disruptive power. Husband was a term that many of my participants viewed as powerful for its potential to interrupt and disrupt heteronormative logic. And this was often compared to the more gender-neutral term partner, which all of the participants said that they used prior to marriage. Rick recalled instances on the telephone where, having stated that he was married, he'd had to correct the call center representative who had asked for his wife's details. And he says, like, I've had a few instances and they will ask, oh, what does your wife do? And I'll say, oh, actually, it's my husband. And it's been a bit awkward. I think they felt more awkward than I do. I do find it funny because they're the ones who are squirming. Now, this is a typical example of the disruptive power that interviewees understood and felt the term husband as carrying. a power that comes from the appropriation of a heteronormative term and the articulation of that very feminine phrase, husband, my husband, by someone who identifies as a man. Those moments of awkwardness that Rick identifies here, and which many LGBTQ people have surely encountered in different contexts, that can be understood as moments of sexual dissidence, a queer resistance to normative thinking. They're instances of everyday defiance and a refusal, but also moments of pride. As another interviewee, Mitchell, stated, the first time I used it, it's like, oh, it's a bit of a jolt. I'm quite proud to say husband. And that kind of pride and political dimension of the word was also picked up by Greg, who stated that it's nice to be able to say husband. And also, I think we've also felt that people had fought for the right for us to do it. And because people had fought for it, that we should do it. And it was right to use it. It felt equal. It's nice to say husband and married. Meanwhile, Dominic, who was arguably more reserved than Rick or Greg or Mitchell, also identified the power of this term when discussing how we went about deciding when and where to use it. And he said, if you bump into a random salesperson on the street, you might say, oh, my husband. But if you're having a meeting in the bank and you're talking more formally, you say, my partner. I think if I want to be I don't want to be confrontational, not challenging, then partner. But like a salesman is a perfect example. I'll say my husband without a shadow of a doubt. Here we clearly see the use of gendered terminology being negotiated in relation to arrangements of power. In the more formal setting of a meeting at a bank, Dominic doesn't want to be read as confrontational or challenging and elects to use the gender-neutral term partner, a term that's so neutral that it implies neither a romantic or intimate relationship. Meanwhile, when faced with the random salesperson in the street, Dominic feels more assertive and deploys husband without a shadow of a doubt. Reflecting on what this division meant to him and further underscoring the potential disruption of this term, Dominic suggested that it depends on the person you're speaking to. You get a sense, it's almost like, do I want to fit in? Now, of course, the decision over when and where and how to fit in was closely tied to the use of the word husband in many of the interviews and resonates with a much broader discussion of coming out, passing, and public visibility. For many of my respondents, marriage had created yet another choice, but also another challenge in the ongoing negotiation work that is part and parcel of being queer in a straight world. To use the word husband was to come out in a very specific and explicit way. One that not only said, I'm gay, but also signified the occupation of a discursive and cultural and legal space that until very recently had been the sole preserve of heterosexuality. So the queer critique of homonormativity suggests that marriage promotes the belief that gay people are no different to heterosexual people. Marriage, so the argument goes, helps to reassure the straights next door that we are good people too, that we are, to use Andrew Sullivan's phrase, virtually normal. Yet while marriage can be read as a normative practice, my interviewees revealed how the taking on of marriage by queer folk, the use of its terms of reference, the performance of its rituals, the reproduction of its practices, all of these serve to disrupt heteronormative understandings of marriage at the very point where critics said we are just trying to fit in. In other words, if same-sex marriage is an act of assimilation, it must also be an act of appropriation in the subcultural sense, a reworking of objects and language and practices to create new styles, new identities, and newer ways of being in the world. And to me, that sounds decidedly queer, a decidedly queer project. So the queer critique of marriage is a legitimate and it continues to remain relevant, perhaps more than ever, as we see the fight for same-sex marriage taking centre stage in many more national contexts. What I hope to have demonstrated here is the need to continue exploring queer lives, even once they've crossed that threshold over and into marriage. Because while the pursuit of same-sex marriage rights might well be equated with a domestication and a political declawing of gay civil rights. The everyday lives of married gay men appear to be permeated with moments of public and semi-public outing and self-identification. And this occupation of space, that discursive, that physical, that legal space, that feels decidedly queer. Now, we might rightly question whether such occupation is deliberate, consciously political, for the benefit of other non-heterosexual folk. And I think those are important questions to ask. But I'd also suggest that any occupation of heteronormative life by non-heterosexual people is always a political act. Whether it be opening a joint bank account, or whether it be changing your emergency contact details with your human resources department, this kind of taking up of quotidian space demands that we must be recognized at the same time that it highlights the ongoing privilege of heteronormativity's most sacred institution in what some call this post-equalities society. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.